All right. Welcome to the Boats Based on a True Story inaugural podcast. Just me today. I'm hoping there'll be guest hosts with me in time. I just wanted to try this out. First, I'm recording it on Riverside. Um, and we'll see how it goes, see how it uploads to Patreon, how it feeds to Apple and things like that, how I can edit it. But in the meantime, let's get to the movie. The first movie is Nuremberg, out recently, heavily promoted. It's kind of disappearing from the theaters pretty quickly already, but that's a sign of the times. That's a movie theater business model, I guess, possible. The first thing that struck me is it always amazes me. I'm almost 60 years old that there's yet another World War II story that we've not heard before. This one portrays itself, if you've seen the ads, as being a story of the psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, played by Rami Malek, and his relationship with a prisoner and a member of the Nazi high command, Hermann Goering, played by Russell Crowe, at the Nuremberg trials right after the end of the war in the European theater in Germany. What I'm typically going to go over, and today's no exception, is like what the movie gets historically right, what the movie makes up for purposes of producing a Hollywood movie, and plus a mixed category where it's a little bit right and a little bit made up. And then lastly, what they left out that might have been worth including. And there's a couple interesting things in that category with this movie, but I'm also going to start out with some historical context. That they obviously couldn't get into and maybe assume even though it's a 2.5 hour movie, very, very focused on one small niche within the Nuremberg trials is what I'm going to argue. I got to include some trigger warnings up front. This movie is based on true stories of Nazi atrocities and will include references to genocide, the Holocaust, mass murder, suicide, and few other anecdotes from history that anyone would find disturbing, even if you've heard them before. Also, why this movie is timely. I didn't think about this until I watched it and read the book that we'll get into in a second. A couple reasons. One is the concept of the Nuremberg defense, something you've heard before. If you're not familiar with that saying, it comes out of this trial. It's the excuse that, hey, I was just following orders. You can't punish me or prosecute me for what I did. You're hearing this already in the news in regards to what reporters can see members of Immigration and Customs Enforcement doing in the United States right now, generally. But even more recently, the notion that it is the duty of active servicemen and women to decline an unlawful order. This is a huge issue now in Washington because some veterans who are serving in Congress have made that statement, and then other politicians in Washington say that is unlawful for them to even say that, if not treasonous. So we're going to get into that. And lastly, this just came up yesterday. I was researching podcast recording and editing software. This notion currently under investigation that Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, sorry, I'm not playing that game with him, may have ordered troops to kill any survivors of one of the recent attacks on a Venezuelan boat. More on that at the end, but that's important context as you hear about this, if you've seen the movie and think about it again, or if you're going to go see the movie soon or wait for it on streaming, have these things in the back of your mind. It makes the movie that much more relevant. So to the movie. The movie was adapted from the book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist by Jack Elhaye, not by the Dr. Kelly in the movie, the lead in the movie played by Rami Malek. Kelly did write a book long out of print. Elhaye's book was created out of notes he got from Kelly's son long after Dr. Kelly was dead. And that book did not sell a lot. And as I said, it's out of print. So it's interesting that there is a book about this story, but that's not the source for the movie. I read a book called The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials by Telford Taylor. I'll hold it up here. Unfortunately, the biggest book on the subject. Telford Taylor was part of the prosecution team from the United States. He became head of the prosecution team from America after Justice Jackson, who we'll talk about a lot, went back to the U.S. Look, everyone's got their bias or point of emphasis. There are a couple other books about the Nuremberg trials. Taylor was an eyewitness to all of it. It's interesting. He's not in the movie. That's how small a role he played in the very first trial, which is the focus of this movie. He plays a much more prominent role in the next dozen trials. I think there were like 13 in total. So take that into consideration. But he was an observer and an educated and active participant in the trials. So to the cast and characters, if you've seen, they promoted the heck out of this. They really did. Hermann Goering, the head Nazi after the suicides of Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels, played by Russell Crowe. Dr. Douglas Kelly, the psychiatrist, Rami Malek, as I said. Sergeant Howie Triest, interpreter, I hope I'm saying his last name right, Leo Woodall. And Gustav Gilbert, another doctor, chief psychologist, played by Colin Hanks. And the Justice Robert Jackson, played by Michael Shannon. Boy, he's really blown up, hasn't he? It's almost like you get this sense that Hollywood makes a determination. This is this person's time to become a leading actor, actress, and they are just everywhere on talk shows and interviews and promotions specifically for this movie. He was great. Then there's Burton Andress, who ran the prison. That's the character played by John Slattery of Mad Men fame. This is where it kind of gave me a feeling of a little bit of a, and I'm not doing movie reviews here, but a little bit of a, what do you call it, star-studded cast, because Slattery's playing a smaller role, but he killed it. He was great in this role. Other characters, Rudolf Hess, and now you have some German actors whose names I didn't recognize, you might not either. Baldur von Schirach, another prisoner. Fife, who is the British lawyer and played by the brilliant British actor Richard Grant. And all the way down to one character worth mentioning, Robert Lay, played by Tom Kuhn, I think is his last name. He was one of the first. There was basically 22 Nazis originally in the very first trial. And my understanding is they were chosen based on how much evidence was available to prosecuting them. And they also, maybe not by coincidence, were the most prominent members of Nazi leadership, if you will, at the time of the trial. And then the trials went down the line kind of from there. It took several years. So let's set up the Nuremberg trials. You know, as I think about the history leading up to this and reading this book, you know, I envision like two mutually exclusive, you know, circles. One is international law and the other is war crimes, right? And if you think about the notion of international law could go back as far as Caesar in the early days of Western civilization, right? And it begins to play a bigger role, and I'm fast forwarding a lot here, during the American Revolution. And then again, when President Jefferson sends the Navy with the Marines to the shores of Tripoli to defend ships under the U.S. flag from being pirated in foreign wars. Like, who gets to decide what international law means? And also, who gets to decide what a war crime is? And I think both of these like enter our collective conscious during the early days of the 20th century and into World War I, where you had the first stage of The Hague, which was known as the International Court of Justice. Hague was founded at the end of World War II, was the successor to the Court of International Justice created out of the League of Nations after World War I. You had the Geneva Conventions that also came out of World War II. So this was really like just a huge moment in history, in world history, not just because of the crimes and the genocide and everything like that, but what are we going to do about this to prevent this going forward? How do we live with each other? The trials were envisioned before the war in Europe was even over. Once they knew they were going to win, you know, started with FDR and then Truman took over. But Churchill just wanted to shoot them all, by the way, from the British perspective. It was this guy, Justice Jackson, he didn't. And there's very interesting dialogue between him and his wife in the beginning of the movie where he defends the idea while she says it can't be done. A very nice device to kind of set up the complexity of what I just talked about, what I'm going to read from his opening statements in a second. Jackson's argument wins the day, but, you know, why did Jackson think this was so important? So as I was reading this book and I read his opening statements, it was such a nice summary of everything historically leading up to that moment and what might transpire afterwards. I was like, man, I hope they didn't leave this out of the movie. I read the book first and then I went in and they gave an abbreviated version of it, but they did include it. And this was considered peak Jackson by all the observers and participants. And I'm going to actually read the whole thing to you. It's not that long, but it's relevant. It does a better job than I could of explaining the importance of this event and context. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, so the four nations that participated in the prosecution were the U.S., Britain, France, and the Soviets. The four great nations, flush with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies of the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. He goes on to address Victor's justice. Before I discuss particulars of evidence, some general considerations which may affect the credit of this trial in the eyes of the world should be candidly faced. There is a dramatic disparity between the circumstances of the accusers and the accused that might discredit our work if we should falter, in even minor matters, in being fair and temperate. Unfortunately, the nature of these crimes is such that both prosecution and judgment must be victor nations over vanquished foes. The worldwide scope of the aggressions carried out by these men has left but few real neutrals. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our lips as well. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our task that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice. Make it clear earlier, which I don't think I did, but this statement probably does a better job of, is this is a trial. There was prosecution. The Nazis had defense lawyers, and there were, I think, 9 justices sitting as judges. He continued, we would also make clear that we have no purpose to incriminate the whole German people. If the German populace had willingly accepted the Nazi program, no stormtroopers would have been needed in the early days of the party, and there would have been no need for concentration camps or the Gestapo. The German, no less than the non-German world, has accounts to settle with these defendants. And lastly, the catalog of crimes will omit nothing that could be conceived by a pathological prince, cruelty, and lust for power. Against their opponents, including Jews, Catholics, and free labor, the Nazis directed such a campaign of arrogance, brutality, and annihilation as the world has not witnessed since the pre-Christian era. At length, bestiality and bad faith reach such excess that they arouse sleeping strength of imperiled civilization. Its united efforts have ground the Nazi war machine to fragments, but the struggle has left Europe a liberated yet prostrate land where a demoralized society struggles to survive. These are the fruits of the sinister forces that sit with the defendants in the prisoner's dock. So, pretty powerful opening statement. And it's also, it'll come out in the notes, important to know that the world really didn't know yet what happened in terms of the Holocaust, labor camps, and things like that. It was when mostly U.S. troops started liberating those camps and started taking pictures, and there was video. Rumors start to circulate, and this is the way the story's told. And people are like, what? No way. They didn't believe it. And that's another big part of this trial, was making the evidence public for the world to see. All right. I mentioned the U.S., France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, judges from all 4 countries. My understanding from the book is that the country's prosecutors got to prosecute the defendants that they had held as prisoners of war leading up to the end of the war. So, if there were 22 defendants in the first trial and America had 12 of them as prisoner of wars, they got to prosecute those 12, France the next 8, and so on. This was a trial. Other important facts. The U.S. entered the war in 1941, and I mentioned this because of something I opened with. We'll talk about it later, just historical context. So we entered the war in 1941. The Barbarossa order that the invasion of the Soviet Union was a war of extermination, according to Hitler, endorsing war crimes against civilians. And then in October 1942, Hitler instructed his military to basically take no prisoners anywhere, which was a violation of Hague already, as it was in existence. But, here we go. The term genocide actually just shows up in the vernacular right about this time. And the word Holocaust starts getting capitalized and used specifically in relation to European Jews not until the 70s. What were the goals of the trial? Basically to give meaning to the war against Germany and validate, significant Allied casualties and maintain harmony between the United Nations. I would add, as I said, to put the evidence in the public spheres. The public still didn't know the extent of the human tragedies, and when they heard them, still remained in disbelief. It took a long time. So what were the charges? There were 4 counts. And this is also very interesting. 1 and 2 were conspiracy to wage war and waging aggressive war. And I think conspiracy was a bit of an umbrella term to help rope in industrialists and bankers, the guys that financed the war and built the weapons, which they did. Waging aggressive war, I interpret to mean unprovoked. They didn't declare war. They were just gathering real estate. Then 3 and 4 were war crimes and crimes against humanity, which included work camps were illegal under international law, even at this time, having prisoners put to work for however in the war effort, if you will, supporting the war effort. But extermination camps also obviously qualify here, but there were both. In the first trial, there were 22 high-ranking Nazis, and it was the first two counts that they emphasized because these were the folks that were responsible for initiating each step in the rise of the Nazi regime and war on Europe. Translation was an issue that came up in the movie, specifically in the interrogation of Goering by Jackson, but just more broadly, if you've seen the black and white videos, you can see all the Nazis with headphones on, and somebody somewhere is translating the prosecution's comments and defense, everything that's being said publicly into their language through their headphones, which was probably a bigger problem for the Soviets than anyone. They just didn't have as many English speakers or German language speakers. All right, back to getting right to the bulk of what I'm trying to do here with this podcast. What did they get right? Some of these are just like important historical points. Some were treated at length. Others dealt with a single line of dialogue. It's like a 2.5-hour movie. I thought they were important. I was thrilled at how they kind of worked them into the script. But if you don't understand the history, you might not even realize just how relevant it was. And we'll get to some of that. First, there's a crazy story, and it was dealt with almost in a cartoonish fashion in the movie, which was weird because the rest of it was so seriously done. And it was the guy Rudolf Hess, the Nazi. He really did fly solo to Britain. He actually landed in Scotland, I think specifically, presumably to talk to the Brits about a compromise and get them to join the Germans against the Soviets. This is what the Soviets believed. And he was immediately arrested and sat in prison. I think that was 1941. Like we were just getting into the war, and Rudolf Hess was already in a British prison awaiting the end of the war and the Nuremberg trials. The issue with him was he crazy? He claimed amnesia. We'll get more into that and why we focus on the psychiatrist role at all. It was a device to explain, I think, the relevance of psychiatrists being present and at all in these proceedings. Again, spoiler alerts abound. I'm going to leave one to the very end just in case, but these are historical facts. The character Robert Ley, the Nazi Robert Ley, did one of the first 22 did commit suicide in his cell. And this brings up the issue again of why the psychiatrists or the psychologists were there, what they were supposed to be doing. The question was raised in the book and a little bit in the movie, analyzing their competency to stand trial. I find this confusing, right? I mean, like there's two issues. One was handicapping suicide, and there's a scene probably made up again for the reason of communicating to you some state of mind of the Americans generally, and John Slattery's character as the prison guard. He marches up and down. He says, "We've checked your clothes 5 times. We've checked the room 10 times. We've made sure there is nothing available to you that will allow you to commit suicide." That was a big deal. They wanted them to stand trial. And of course, they really wanted them to be punished. So you bring in psychiatrists to find out if they are mentally capable of standing trial, whether they are going to try to commit suicide. And then the third element that came up with Rudolf Hess was amnesia. To me, it was very strange. I mean, they're Nazis, and this is going to come back huge at the end of this episode when we talk about Dr. Kelly's only real takeaway from his time with the Nazis, which in the movie he claims is like thousands of hours. I don't think mathematically that's possible, but he did spend a lot of time with them. He had nothing else to do. I'm not sure what his assignment was other than with the psychologist Gilbert to judge their ability mentally. Are they mentally fit to stand trial? Again, they're Nazis. The other thing the movie got right was Justice Robert Jackson didn't do great. Those opening statements that I read, for which he was roundly praised, was his peak, and his closing remarks. There is some view, even from Telford Taylor, an American, that the view from the trials was that the British prosecutors were generally considered better than the Americans. I don't know how much that was skewed just by Robert Jackson's struggles in interrogating Goering. It's also worth mentioning that Jackson was the lead prosecutor, and the scene you see in the movie is intended to be a cross-examination. Like someone on his prosecution team had already stood up at the podium and asked Gearing a bunch of questions. His defense attorney spoke on his behalf, and then Jackson comes in for the cross, and that's where it didn't go well. They don't show the initial prosecutor's efforts. You have no idea that this is one of 20 some odd trials that they are going to try to complete over a couple of months, or whatever it was. The movie is all about Gearing and the psychiatrist, Kelly's. How was Jackson off? My view from the reading is that in the trial for Gearing, Jackson lists like all these anti-Jewish German laws that Goering signed off. I was like, well, didn't you sign off on the Nuremberg laws in 1935? Oh, yeah, that was me. Exclusions of Jews from the economy, 1938. Yep, that sounds about right. This is Goering, acknowledging all the accusations. Impositions of fines and seizures of property, also 1938. Yep, currency and property transfer restrictions. Yep, that was me. So why was he so casually acknowledging this, and why was that a miss for Jackson? Again, I'm not a lawyer or a professional historian, but in reading this book by a lawyer, it sounds to me like a very simple carve out. What Germans did to other Germans in Germany was not part of this trial. This is about international law. And so there was really there was no reason to prosecute Goering on those counts. Now, Jackson takes that thread and extends it outside of Germany, like to Czechoslovakia, right? And Goering said, yeah, well, if you knew your history, you know that was part of Germany and remains so in our minds, right? And then there's a lot of reference to the unjust Treaty of Versailles, which World War II historians will be very familiar with, and how it led to kind of the rise of Hitler. But so Jackson missed on understanding the history of Germany, really, and the way Germans kind of viewed themselves and their country. Regarding the role of the psychologist, which is Gilbert, played by Colin Hanks, there was a judgment call by the doctor, specifically Gilbert, where he was asked to provide a professional view on Hess's claim of amnesia. And it's just one line in the movie, but it really did happen. And again, Gilbert's like, yeah, I think he's really got amnesia. Like, I don't know. Why is this even coming up? I mean, again, I do emphasize that this was run like a real trial. And in a trial domestically in the United States, that would be a judgment. This person is not mentally capable of standing trial or something like that. But I don't know. I feel like he was a little quick to say, sure. Yeah, he can't remember. Because also, if you read the story, his amnesia kind of comes and goes, if you will. Let's see. There's an uncomfortable truce in the real prosecution, such as I'll go through them. And the third one is the one that was brought up in the movie. The first two weren't. One is the Munich Agreement, where British and France basically sacrificed Czechoslovakia as a kind of a form of appeasement agreement to Hitler, which then Hitler quickly violated. But the Munich Agreement, happened. It's not in the movie, but it happened in 1938. Then there's the 1939, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, right? Publicly a non-aggression pact, but was secretly a way to divide up Eastern Europe at some point in the future and allow Germany basically to invade Poland without interference from the Soviets. And I think Finland, which was invaded, was also covered under this pact. What was talked about in the movie was the invasion of Norway. So Britain basically had a plot, which was a contingency plan from like April 1940 to occupy Norwegian ports aggressively, and to do that in case Germany retaliated against a British operation to mine Norwegian waters. So Germany eventually invades Norway, Operation Weserübung. My German's a little lacking. That happened first, and I think only the invasion of Norway of these three was brought up in the movie, and it was in private quarters where Jackson is talking about it to his British counterpart, and the guy goes, yeah, we just have to deny that it happened, There's we'll get into it, but there's this notion, it's Latin, tu quoque, and it has to do with, hey, you did it, and you didn't think it was illegal. How can you say it's illegal for us to do it. And I'll just bring that up now. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. All right. What did they make up in the movie? Based on my research. Well, basically the entire narrative thread that the movie's based on, that the psychiatrist Kelly was somehow important to the prosecution. He did have all these long hours and getting to know the Nazis critical to the prosecution. I think that scene towards the end, if you've seen it, where he gives Jackson his notes and then the notes get passed on to his British counterpart, and they have a zinger of a question to Goering that locks up the prosecution, was not based on any insight that Kelly gave. That's my belief. But this leads to an interesting discussion again. Why were they there? Why did they end up doing what they did with their time, Kelly and Gilbert? I think it was purely to judge the prisoner's ability to stand trial and be on the lookout for suicide. That was it. But in a telling scene in the movie, there's a scene in the library early on with the translator, driver, and Kelly, where Kelly acts like the curious scientist. I've known a lot of PhD scientists and doctors, and I can totally see this, right? His mindset is, oh my God, professionally, I'm going to get a firsthand look into the mindset of psychopaths. I'm going to see and learn about evil up close and personal. And when I get home, I'm going to write a book and make a lot of money, you know? I don't know if that scene was made up, but I'm just saying it resonates with me as something potentially truthful. And just being a curious scientist, like having that opportunity, whether you wrote a book and made money off of it or not, I can see that mindset. In the book I read, Gilbert plays a much more prominent role. I mean, there in the index, there are 15 references to Dr. Gilbert and 3 for Kelly, if that indicates anything, I don't know. But mostly, it sounds like Gilbert was just making observations about the prisoners during the trial. You can read them. And again, I don't know that they're terribly helpful or meaningful, but they were there overlapping only for a brief amount of time. Kelly showed up first, then Gilbert came in. There was some overlap, and then Kelly left and Gilbert stayed. There's some weirdness going on where Kelly he's passing letters back and forth between Goering and his wife and daughter, who are living somewhere nearby, off campus, if you will. He did do that in real life, but in the movie, they extended to this like big relationship developed between Dr. Kelly and the wife and the daughter. There's this like montage to suggest they got very close, you know, Kelly playing piano with the daughter and all that. That did not happen. He did pass the letters back and forth in violation of policy, but it was Gilbert, the psychologist, who actually did visit the wife and daughter at their home. But the larger story about Kelly becoming chummy with them is a fabrication. Also, and this is just my ad lib, a reality dose about the state of psychiatry in 1945, which as a comedian I talk a lot about on stage, and I've never done therapy, but I've read a crap ton about it, not just talk therapy, but drug therapy, both prescription and recreational, including the psychedelics. So based on that, like 1945, you have to think about the state of psychiatry in 1945. Okay. The profession was not far removed from the eugenics movement in the early 1900s in the United States, or the practice of lobotomies, right? And it would be another 30 years before homosexuality was not considered a mental illness by the profession. So just again, context of who these doctors were and what they were armed with educationally. So the whole concept of value added from these guys feels specious to me from the outset. And again, the amnesia diagnosis, get lost, whatever. What else did they make up? So there's a female journalist who I think's name is Lila, based on like, you know, IMDb, but I don't really remember ever hearing her name. In the story, Kelly, at a moment of frustration after a couple of drinks, spills everything he knows that's been going on about his work with the Nazis. And then the next day, there's a front page story in the newspaper that she has written. That did not happen. Meeting Jackson. There's a scene where Jackson has a meeting with the Pope and basically blackmails the Pope into supporting the trials. Why? I don't know. It was in Germany. It wasn't in Italy, you know, but it was an opportunity to make great historical points about the complicity or complacency of the Vatican in the face of Italian and German fascism and the treatment of Jews. But the blackmail conversation didn't happen. Mix some truth, some fiction blended together. That female journalist, there were several female journalists covering the trials, two in particular that felt the most prominent in my limited work, Rebecca West and Janet Flanner. And it's possible that sometimes in these movies they'll combine characters, true characters, into one. Out of expediency, and that's possible. But Lila she could have been the combination of the two. I can't say for sure. There's another reference in the movie to Gearing having a lot of pain meds on him when they first got him. There's a little discrepancy in the research in my mind on whether he surrendered or was caught. I think he intentionally had himself caught, is what it sounds like. Better the Americans than the Russians. That's another kind of historical fact. So he had a lot of injuries from World War I, Goering did, and he had these massive amounts of pain meds on him that they took away from him when he became a prisoner in Nuremberg. And according to the book anyway, this is Telford Taylor's view, the combination of being pulled off the meds and, a prisoner's diet caused him to thin out a lot. If you've seen the commercials for the movie or seen the movie, you see Russell Crowe is huge, right? He's very heavy. And as was Goering when he was caught. But if you look at photos from the trial, Taylor's story kind of plays out in that he lost a lot of weight and that big suit was kind of hanging off him. They made some weird references to Goering being fat and on the drugs, and he was going to attempt to get in shape. They show him doing push-ups, but the character played by Crowe lost no weight in the movie. And, as I said, in reality, as the trial played out, that big suit started to hang off him a fair bit. Okay. Tu quoque. It's a Latin term meaning you too, and it refers to this logical fallacy where an argument is deflected by accusing the accuser of the same thing or similar wrongdoing. That term is not used in the movie, and I could argue it came up once or twice, as in the case of Norway and also in prison labor camps. So we already talked about Norway. The other was Goering and again, I don't know if this conversation happened, but I kind of think it did in regards to counts 3 and 4. Goering brings up the Japanese internment camps here in the U.S., which, were well underway, a horrific period in American history, a great shame, and it included forced labor for little or no pay, like constructing camps, growing food, but also creating camouflage netting and uniforms in support of the war effort, which is what Goering claimed was the purpose of his labor camps that he signed off on to found. All right, so that's the end of the mixed section, some truth, some fiction. What did they leave out? This is great. So back to the journalists. The aforementioned Rebecca West actually had an affair with the senior American judge, the Chief Justice at Nuremberg, Judge Biddle. Doesn't seem to be really hidden either. And it was a real story. Not important, but kind of, if you're looking for you're making up stuff to fluff up a story for Hollywood, that was a good one right there. A big one. Where did Goering, all right, spoiler alert, if you didn't know, the trial's over. Most of them were convicted. 3 were acquitted. Of those that were convicted, there were sentences of death versus long prison terms. Goering is found guilty and sentenced to hang. Right before he is about to be hung, he has a cyanide capsule and eats it and commits suicide. They do not address in the movie at all where he got it from. And truth is, no one knows for sure. There was a real character left out of the movie that's in this book, and I did some independent research on him as well. His name was Jack Tex Wheelis, and he was a young, tall, probably from Texas, a prison guard. And based on photos and some of Telford Taylor's notes, he really did become pretty cordial with many of the prisoners, and including Goering. And you can see photos of them smiling and laughing. He did back and forth, spend a lot of time with them. So the theory posited by this book that I read is that Tex scored the cyanide for Goering, and could have been a good shadowy character and device to have thrown in the movie. Again, he really did exist. There's no better answer. You'd be speculating, but it would have been a horrible, speculation. Epilogue. The 3 acquitted in the first trial of the tribunal were eventually convicted under German law. This is a fascinating story. So these guys are acquitted. They're free to go, and they're in Germany. And the Germans that are now in charge of the country, I have to look up that whole history. They're waiting for them. They're just waiting for you step outside this grounds where the trial's taking place and protected, by the armies, respectively, we are going to arrest you. And they were. In total, over all the trials, 177 defendants, 24 sentenced to death, 20 to life in prison. As I said earlier, there were more trials in Germany to actually prosecute the camp administrators, which I didn't go through all the prisoners, but I didn't play much of a role in the first trial. Rudolf Hess escaped the hangman's noose. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he died in prison in 1987. Goering's wife lived until 1973. I just find that stuff mind-blowing, that there were people involved in this that were still walking around for decades after the war, not even including the ones like Eichmann that, escaped and hid or in South America for decades. Okay, conclusion. Why is this movie timely again? This is like my big takeaway. The one is what I mentioned before, which is the Nuremberg defense, the notion that the duty of an active serviceman, man or woman, is to decline an unlawful order. That's how it is in the United States right now. This finding that didn't exist before the tribunal, that the Nuremberg defense was invalid. They just declared it invalid. Okay. But that trial and that finding is literally the source of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that obligates current service members to decline an unlawful order. It is a principle established by the Nuremberg trials that is playing out at this very moment in the United States. The other question raised by the movie was, what is fascism? Could it happen again? And how would we recognize it? So Douglas Kelly kind of leaves after this first trial, goes back to the United States. Oh, by the way, there was a supposedly an agreement between the two doctors, Kelly the psychiatrist and Gilbert the psychologist, to go back home and write a book together that evidently Kelly reneged on, wrote his own book. It didn't go well, sold a few copies, well out of print. I don't think there are any around. Otherwise, it would have been used as a source of this movie. But his findings were, at the end of the day, after spending, in his mind, thousands of hours with all these Nazis, is they weren't special. It wasn't what he thought he was going to get this proprietary look into what is evil, right? And be the next Freud or whatever. That wasn't his conclusion. Nazis, fascism, whatever you want to call it, in his view, always had the potential for coming alive in Western societies, including our country specifically. And he claims he saw it immediately when he came back from Europe. And it's certainly tragically easy to find now. In the movie, Kelly says, "What do you think we'll recognize them the next time by their fancy suits or something like that?" You have to be more aware that it's happening around you. And of course, since the end of World War II, we had Pol Pot in Cambodia. Boy, it's not a great book. It's called Voices from S-21, Terror and History in Pol Pot's Secret Prison. It's not Shakespeare, but it's just a technical report on one location in that genocide. But what Kelly said and wrote about will resonate if you read that story. Then you have Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And on this point, there are two more stories supporting Kelly's opinion, in my opinion. One is there's a book called Neighbors, The Destruction of the Jewish Community in, I believe it's pronounced Jedwabne, in Poland. It's been a long time since I read the book, and some of the details have been challenged. But basically, the argument of the author, who's a researcher, I think a professor at Princeton, is you had Jews and Gentiles living together in this small community in Poland for generations, if not centuries. Nazis invade Poland, they roll through town and basically shrug and go, the Jews have no more rights to own a business, to own property, to be in government, to do anything. And soon thereafter, the community was destroyed and the Jews murdered, okay? And originally what Poland tried to do was to blame it on the Nazis. But again, this researcher who wrote the book, the author, was suggesting, no, it was done by the non-Jewish members of this community. And he doesn't even argue that the Nazis compelled the massacre. All they said is, do what you want. So the Polish neighbors, feeling that there would be no repercussions, supposedly, according to the book, exercised the power to club, drown, and burn their neighbors out of existence. The second story, which is kind of related, is a famous experiment by the psychologist Stanley Milgram called the Milgram experiment in the 60s. In the experiment, he set up, he used actors to be basically patients or learners. And then you had the teachers. And these were people brought in, volunteers, who did not know that this was an experiment. And the idea was that the actors who were in another room and could be seen were hooked up to these electrodes, and
They made up some challenge, like it was a memory test. And in the Milgram experiment, the volunteers who had the button to shock, they didn't know it was an actor in the other room, the student. All right. I'm the volunteer. I'm playing the teacher. If they got the answer wrong, they zapped them and gave him a shock. As the authority figure, they could do that. And the study was about, what it meant to be able to cause harm, believing you were causing severe pain to another person just because you were either told to and or that you could. And there were some teachers, some volunteers that couldn't go through it. They backed out. They were very distressed. I've seen some of the stories, watching this person, and the actors would, writhe in pain more and more after every shock. But there are a lot of people that just kept hitting the button. All right, here's the last spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen the movie and you don't want to know one little detail, they leave it to the very end, kind of the where are they now Star Wars text floating through the screen. I'll let you go now. I'm assuming you're gone. Tragically, Dr. Kelly himself commits suicide like a decade after the war using a cyanide capsule, as did Goering. So, hope you learned something. Hope this was somewhat entertaining. That is the goal. I'll post this on Patreon, hopefully, maybe feed it to Apple Podcasts if I can figure out how. And we'll do another one every week. Thanks for stopping in to Based on a True Story podcast.